Whatever Livingston County has become, in peaceful and worthy rivalship with her sister counties of those lovely regions watered by Genesee River, is the product of that pioneer life which, though in conflict at times with wildness in aboriginal man and animal, was ever in harmony with nature's thrift and quiet. Like her noble river, which out of rocks and fastness descends through green meadows, brown glens, purple orchards, and silvery wheat fields, blessing and blessed, the rural life of Livingston County flows on now, as it flowed in colonial days, only leaping at intervals to agitation in the spirit of manhood, springing towards righteous liberty, as those falls of the Genesee, always true to nature, flash out their waters in the spirit of freedom.
Many Indian nations occupied the North American woodlands prior to white settlement. The French called the nations in New York the Iroquois. The English referred to them as the Five Nations, but they called themselves the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. From west to east, the Five Nations are Seneca, keepers of the western door; Cayuga, people of the Muckland; Onondaga, keepers of the central fire; Oneida, people of the standing stone; and Mohawk, keepers of the eastern door. In 1714, the Tuscarora came from what is now North Carolina to join the Confederacy, and henceforth the English called them the Confederacy of the Six Nations. The nations agreed to live peacefully under an imaginary longhouse that stretched across New York State. The Seneca were the most populous and powerful of the confederated Iroquois tribes. Their land extended from Seneca Lake west to Lake Erie. Many of their principal towns were in the fertile Genesee Valley, centered near the Genesee River. The traditional Iroquois dwelling unit was called a longhouse. Constructed of sheets of elm bark lashed on stout poles, this dwelling housed multiple families, all living in close quarters divided into sections. The families shared a central fire. Houses and land belonged to the women, for the right of ownership descended in the mother line. Notably, Iroquois political organization was matriarchal as well. Women were entitled to formally select chiefs and to participate in tribal or village decisions.
The Senecas had more than a dozen varieties of corn and cultivated them with studious care. They had several varieties of squash and melon and 10 or more varieties of beans. They grew sunflowers for the oil, which they expressed from the seeds. Corn was prepared in many ways, among them corn soup, gruel, hominy, samp, hulled corn, corn bread, corn pudding, and parched cornmeal. These corn foods were mixed with beans, berries, nuts, and sunflower oil. The Iroquois corn culture was a well-developed thing. It exercised a powerful influence upon their social and economic life and was largely responsible for a sedentary village existence. The religion of the Senecas was one of thanksgiving. Each season had its Thanksgiving ceremony in which the Creator and his subordinate spirits were thanked for their gifts.
In 1779, General George Washington sent General John Sullivan into the heart of Seneca Indian Territory with orders to destroy all settlements. Sullivan combined forces with General James Clinton's army for a total of about 5,000 men to lead the largest offensive movement of the Revolution into central and western New York, with the objective of stopping the deadly British, Tory, and Indian raids on frontier settlements across the state. When the army reached present-day Livingston County, they encountered the only organized resistance of the campaign outside of the Newtown battlefield near Elmira. On the morning of Saturday, September 12, 1779, General Sullivan's troops broke camp near Honeoye Lake. Sullivan estimated his distance from the principal Seneca town, most commonly known as Little Beardstown, near the Genesee River, at about 25 miles. The army of several thousand marched around the foot of Hemlock Lake and continued about 2 miles over the steep and rough terrain to camp at Foots Corners overlooking Canisius Lake. General Sullivan believed he was not far from the principal Seneca town near the Genesee River, and he ordered Lieutenant Thomas Boyd to assemble a scouting party of 5 or 6 men to determine the exact location. Instead, Boyd took about 25 men and an Oneida Indian guide, and the group left in the middle of the night, heading south around the head of Canisius Lake and up over a steep embankment now known as Groveland Hill. In the darkness, the scouting party passed British loyalists, Colonel John Butler's right flank, comprised of several hundred Tories and Indians positioned along the top of the hill, watching the main army's movements on the opposite side of the lake. Neither Boyd nor Butler realized each other's presence. The scouts traveled a few miles in search of the main village, and upon their return the next morning they encountered Indians along the trail. And despite the advice of his Oneida guide, Boyd pursued them. This reckless decision proved to be a fatal mistake. As Lieutenant Boyd and his scouting party were trying to return to the main army to report his findings, his pursuit of Indians led to a chase of some distance. The Indians lured the scouts directly toward enemy lines, and before Boyd realized, approximately 800 Tories and Indians lying in wait, hoping to surprise Sullivan's army, ambushed the entire scouting party. A few of the scouts escaped, but the rest, including the Oneida guide, were brutally slain. Lieutenant Boyd and Sergeant Michael Parker were captured and taken to Little Beardstown, about 10 miles northwest, where they were tortured and killed. Meanwhile, the main army was busy reinforcing a bridge over the head of Canisius Lake in order to facilitate the movement across the swampy area. The bodies of at least 16 slain soldiers and the Oneida guide at the ambuscade would not be discovered until the army retreated 3 days later, when they were buried with military honors. Shortly after Boyd and Parker were killed, they were abandoned, as all the Indians and Tories hastily fled to avoid direct confrontation with Sullivan's army, including Indian captive Mary Jemison, the white woman of the Genesee. When the army arrived the following day, they discovered the headless and mutilated bodies of Boyd and Parker and buried them with military honors. The next day, the army burned the entire village of 128 homes and set ablaze hundreds of acres of crops and gardens, deterring the Indians from returning that season and forcing the British to care for them at Fort Niagara. This was the western limit and indeed the ultimate destination of the Sullivan Campaign. Having fulfilled General Washington's orders, the Army left Livingston County on September 16, 1779, returning the same route they had advanced.
General John Sullivan's official report to John Jay, President of the Continental Congress, September 30th, 1779. Besides the difficulties which naturally attend marching through an enemy's country, abounding in woods, creeks, rivers, mountains, morasses, and defiles, we found no small inconvenience from the want of proper guides, and the maps of the country are so exceedingly erroneous that they serve not to enlighten, but to perplex. We had not a person who was sufficiently acquainted with the country to conduct a party out of the Indian path by day, or scarcely in it by night, though there were the best I could possibly procure. We had much labor in clearing out the roads for the artillery, notwithstanding which, the army moved from 12 to 16 miles every day, when not detained by rains, or employed in destroying settlements. I feel myself much indebted to the officers of every rank for their unparalleled exertions, and to the soldiers for their unshaken firmness with which they endured the toils and difficulties attending to the expedition. I flatter myself that the orders with which I was entrusted are fully executed, as we have not left a single settlement or field of corn in the country of the Five Nations, nor is there even the appearance of an Indian on this side of Niagara. I have the honor to be, with the most exalted elements of esteem and respect, Your Excellency's most obedient and ever humble servant, John Sullivan.
Many of the journal entries of General Sullivan's soldiers described a horrific scene when the bodies of Boyd and Parker were discovered. While descriptions varied, overall the army appeared severely shaken by the mutilation of the men. Here is an excerpt of Lieutenant Erkery's Beatty's journal depicting the gross magnitude of the situation. Tuesday, September 14th. On entering the town, we found the body of Lieutenant Boyd and another rifleman in the most terrible mangled condition. They were both stripped and naked and their heads cut off, and the flesh of Lieutenant Boyd's head was entirely taken off and his eyes punched out. The other man's head was not there. They were stabbed, I suppose, in 40 different places in the body with a spear, and great gashes cut in their flesh with knives. They was immediately buried with the honor of war. From the diary of Dr. James Campfield, surgeon in Spencer's 5th New Jersey Regiment, at this place we found the mangled bodies of 2 of the men we lost day before yesterday, one known to be Lieutenant Boyd's. These dead bodies had evident signs of having suffered the extremest tortures. Those dastardly wretches, not having bravery to fight us, wreaked their vengeance on a few unfortunate men they never would have dared to meet on equal terms.
Cornplanter was a Seneca war chief and statesman, born at the Seneca village of Canawagus near Avon. During the American Revolution, he was chosen to lead the Iroquois in support of the British in Indian raids throughout the state. He eventually became an ally of the U.S. and was present at all the principal treaties, including the Treaty of Big Tree. Red Jacket was well known as a Seneca orator and political leader, born at a Seneca village near Geneva. During the American Revolution, he was a messenger for British officers and received his namesake coat as a reward. Red Jacket assumed the pivotal role of council orator and participated in nearly every major treaty between whites and Senecas. Despite vigorous opposition, Red Jacket finally agreed to sign the Treaty of Big Tree.
Mary Jemison was born about 1743 on a ship as her parents immigrated to America. She spent her first 13 years on a farm in Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1755, most of her family was captured by a band of French soldiers and Shawnee warriors.
After a hard day's march, we encamped in a thicket. When the Indians had finished their supper, they took from their baggage a number of scalps and went about preparing them by straining them over small hoops and then drying and scraping them by the fire. That being done, they combed the hair in the neatest manner and then painted it red. Those scalps I knew at the time must have been taken from our family by the color of the hair. My mother's hair was red, and I could easily distinguish my father's and the children's from each other. The sight was most appalling. Yet I was obliged to endure it without complaining.
Mary was soon turned over and adopted by the Seneca, eventually adapting to their way of life. The Senecas gave her the name Dehewamis, meaning two falling voices.
One thing only marred my happiness while I lived with them, and that was the recollection that I once had tender parents and a home that I loved.
Mary was given numerous opportunities to have her liberty and return to white society, but every time she elected to remain with her Seneca family and friends.
My strength has been great for a woman of my size. I learned to carry loads on my back soon after my captivity. I have planted, hoed, and harvested corn every season but one since I was taken prisoner.
In 1831, she chose to sell her land and removed to the Buffalo Creek Reservation, where she died at just over 90 years of age. 41 years after her burial, she was reinterred on a bluff in Letchworth State Park, her beloved home.
The enthusiasm generated by soldiers of General Sullivan's army prompted the rapid development of the Genesee Valley shortly after the Revolutionary War ended. News of the beauty and fertility, particularly of the area that now comprises Livingston County, spread as far as Western Europe. Captain Williamson, speaking of the settlement of this region attempted by Oliver Phelps in 1789, says it was attended with great, almost insurmountable difficulties. There was no access to the country but by Indian paths,
and the nearest settlement was over 100 miles distant. The Allegheny Mountains, then never passed, lay on the south, and Lake Ontario on the north, while to the west was one boundless forest. By the census of 1790, there were only 960 souls, including travelers and surveyors with their attendants. The summer of 1792 witnessed a large addition to the population of the Genesee country. In July of that year, the Albany Gazette says, "We are assured of the rapid increase of settlements there, encouraged by the situation, climate, and soil, equal in goodness to any part of the United States, and that the fever and ague, which is common to suppose is epidemic there, has scarcely been known the present season."
A traveler describing the Genesee country in 1792 speaks in glowing terms of the land. The famous Genesee Flats lie on the borders of the Genesee River. They are about 20 miles in length and about 4 miles wide. The soil is remarkably rich, quite clear of trees and producing grass near 10 feet high. I estimate these flats to be well worth 200,000 pounds as they now lie. Taking a view of this country altogether, I do not know an extent of ground so good. Cultivation is easy, and the land is grateful. The progress of settlement is so rapid that you and myself may very probably see the day when we can apply these lines to the Genesee country. Here, happy millions their own lands possess. No tyrant awes them, nor no lords oppress. Many times did I break out in an enthusiastic frenzy, anticipating the probable situation of wilderness 20 years hence. All that reason can ask may be obtained by the industrious hand. The only danger to be feared is that luxuries will flow too cheap.
Colonel Jeremiah Wadsworth of Hartford, Connecticut, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men of the post-Revolutionary War era. In 1788, he made the arduous trip to the Genesee country to judge its worth, finding it richer than he'd ever imagined. After purchasing more than 200,000 acres along the Genesee River, Colonel Wadsworth offered his young cousins, brothers James and William Wadsworth, 2,000 acres of prime farmland in and around what would be Geneseo. In return, they represented the colonel's interests by establishing a home farm and promoting settlement and progress. The Wadsworth brothers acquired thousands more acres, becoming the largest single landowners in western New York. James and William were known far and wide for their philanthropy and innovative farming methods. This prominent family remains synonymous with the Genesee Valley to its present day.
The scene, which lay before Captain Charles Williamson on a summer day at the forks of the Canaseraga and Genesee, delighted him. This spot, he declared, would be Williamsburg, a rendezvous for merchants from east and west. Williamson made plans with the speed of a born promoter in 1792 to build a road from Pennsylvania to the Genesee Valley, where an entire town was to be built. Williamsburg, in the present-day town of Groveland, became the first permanent white settlement of western New York. While Williamson dreamt of thriving cities in the wilderness, the settlement only grew to the size of a village, flourishing until about 1806. From this pioneer settlement derived a series of firsts in the county, including a school, a grist mill, and the first fair and horse races in Genesee country. All that remains today is the 1-acre cemetery.
We finally sailed September 8th, 1803, and were 6 weeks and 3 days in reaching New York. I suffered more from hunger on that trip than ever in my life before or since. The Genesee country was talked of, but there was a current report that there was a very sickly place, while others gave alarming reports of the Indians. My father bought a yoke of oxen and a sled on which he drew our family goods to Caledonia, a 2 weeks trip. Partially clearing small patches of ground, we raised a stint amount of corn and potatoes the first summer. When harvest time came, we worked for farmers at Caledonia, each getting a bushel of wheat for a day's work, some of the women participating in the labor. We had to do without boards for floors until sawmills were established. The Scots were not expert axemen, the labor being new to them. Many a Yankee settler could chop down, cut up for logging, and pile the brush on an acre of land in 4 days, and view with amusement, and often scorn, the haggling of the forest by the Scots.
A canal taking 24 years, stretching 124 miles, and costing more than $6 million would certainly be considered extreme. Yet, despite enormous obstacles, such a project was accomplished between 1837 and 1862, cutting through the core of Livingston County and connecting the Genesee Valley to markets across the country. Construction of the Genesee Valley Canal started in Rochester and proceeded slowly southward to Livingston County. The canal reached Mount Morris by 1840. A junction to Saguenay opened a year later, and then a branch was built to Dansville. But extending the canal through to Nunde and Portage was most challenging as workers battled the area's most rugged terrain along the Genesee River Gorge. After years of delays, 17 locks were completed. But by the time the last segment was finally finished in 1862, railroad transportation outpaced canals, forcing the Genesee Valley Canal to close a few years later.
There were several papers published at different times at various places throughout the county in the first half of the 19th century. The first newspaper published in the county was the Genesee Farmer at Moscow, now known as the Village of Leicester, in 1817. Eventually, the publisher removed it to Geneseo and changed the name to the Livingston Register. The Livingston Journal was the second paper published in the county, started at Geneseo in 1820. In the 1830s, the name was changed to the Livingston Courier. One of the most widely read papers throughout the county was the Livingston Republican, established in Geneseo in 1837. Also in the 1830s, the Village Chronicle was commenced in Dansville and afterward called the Village Record, but was soon discontinued. The Mount Morris Spectator was established in 1834 and united with the Livingston County Whig, and at the time of the consolidation, the name was changed to the Livingston Union. The Nunday News was established in 1859, and over time, the towns of Avon, Caledonia, Lima, Livonia, and Springwater also published newspapers.
After the more pressing needs of the pioneer had been met, schools began to be established. Until as late as 1860, most teachers in the area had received little, if any, professional training. Teaching was held in low esteem, yet education was important. Several prominent academies were established, and there were numerous district schools in each town, pupils often traveling on foot several miles to attend. An outsider's view of an early classroom is told in a letter to the printer in Dansville, 1832. I not long since visited the school of a friend of mine in the country, and if there ever was anything which could approach the description of bedlam, it was this school. I had just got fairly seated when up jumped a young bedlamite with, "Master, Joe housekeeper pinching me." "Joe, did you pinch him?" "No, I say I didn't. It was Bill Grimes, for I seed him when he did it." "Bill, what did you pinch him for?" "'Cause he keeps a crowdin'." Well, soon a class of little ones is called up to read. "Master, mayn't I speak?" "What for?" "'Cause I want to borrow that 'ere straight ruler what Tom Lumpkin's got." "No, keep your seat." Thus my friend and his pack of noisy urchins whiled away the time until the usual intermission.
The rapid development of central and western New York in the first half of the 19th century also coincided with social reform and religious revivalism. The charismatic preacher Charles Finney coined the phrase "burned over district" because so many revivals and diverse enthusiasms were ignited here. Livingston County was fertile ground for progressive new ideas, particularly related to promoting health, education, anti-slavery, temperance, women's rights, and religious experimentation.
Augustus A. Bennett, a veteran of the War of 1812 and a well-known attorney of Western New York, left his home in Avon on horseback for a business trip in 1839 and never returned. He stopped in Dansville and withdrew thousands of dollars from a bank to open a branch in another village. He rode his horse out of sight and never was seen again. He was gone many days before any grave fears were aroused for his safety, owing to the mode of early 19th century travel. According to family members, the horse returned without its rider. Search parties turned up few clues and extended as far as Michigan with no luck. For years afterward, if the family heard of an aged man by the name of Bennett living as a recluse, their hopes were renewed, thinking he'd suffered a lapse in memory. Decades later, however, every trace seemed obliterated of this, quote, man of fine presence, large and commanding figure, unquote.
By 1826, the Shakers had been in America for 50 years and had established a fruitful community at Sodus Bay. When a proposed canal threatened to cut through their property, they feared the worldly influences it would bring. The Sodus Shakers decided to move to Groveland, which was important for its location, midway between the Ohio communities and those in eastern New York. It took 2 years to move. Joseph Pelham wrote in 1837, "We are moving, 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 and if you ever prayed for us, do be so kind as to pray for us now, hard as you can." They were experienced farmers and dedicated workers, and this made Shaker crops much in demand. Brooms, bonnets, and seeds, along with agricultural products, provided the major sources of revenue for the Groveland Shakers. Despite early prosperity, by 1892, there were only 34 Shakers left at Groveland. The costs of sustaining the community had become too immense. The land was sold to the state of New York, and the remaining members relocated to Watervliet, New York.
Long ago, travelers had heard of Avon in the lovely valley of the Genesee.
of its quiet, the efficiency of its waters, and the beauty of its surroundings. The Senecas called the natural sulphur springs around the region Canawagas, the place of stinking water. Grimace was the prevailing feature of countenances when swallowing the beverage for the first few days. The early mornings of the typical guest were spent in walks and conversation, and at midday the bathhouses swarmed with bathers. Then billiards, 10-pins, and other sports for exercise occupied the time until dinner. Then some read, some lounged, and toward the evening, riding parties started off in every direction. At sunset, newcomers were eagerly awaited, for the advent of a fresh guest kept curiosity on tiptoe.
Mineral springs in Avon, Dansville, and Nunde attracted travelers from around the world to enjoy the medicinal effects of water therapy. Most well known was the sprawling resort in Dansville, operated by Dr. James C. Jackson, a leading 19th century holistic health advocate. Dr. Jackson is credited with inventing granola, America's first cold breakfast cereal. His unconventional approach to healing the sick without medicine attracted a huge following of progressive-minded enthusiasts. His main tenet sought wellness through a better understanding of the meaning of life by communing with nature. Patients also received a healthy exposure to progressive social and political issues of the day, including abolitionism, less restricting dress for women, and multi-denominational religious services. On this hillside, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, and Quakers regularly joined together in prayer, song, dance, and communal meals. By the 1860s, our home on the hillside in Dansville was the largest water cure in the world. It operated as a hotel and health resort for over 100 years, drawing national and international clientele to this idyllic setting.
Notice: a farm is wanted for the accommodation of the poor of the county. It must be within 6 miles of the courthouse in the village of Geneseo, and it must contain about 100 acres of land. The land must be of good quality, well timbered, and well supplied with good water. Any person having a farm for sale that will answer the purpose is requested to deliver a particular description of the same to William H. Spencer before the 15th day of December ensuing, stating the quality and quantity of land, how much is in timber, what kind of timber, how much is tilled, how much is in meadow and how much in pasture, and what buildings on it. Also the ready cash price asked for the farm. Geneseo, November 18, 1828. The poorhouse was opened in 1829 on a pleasantly situated farm in Geneseo. By 1849, the house was inadequate given demands on it, and by way of expansion, a new building was erected across the street.
On February 23, 1821, Livingston County, New York, was formed from Ontario and Genesee counties. The county was named in honor of Chancellor Robert R. Livingston, who helped draft the Declaration of Independence and negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. The 12 original towns were Avon, Caledonia, Canisius, Geneseo, Groveland, Leicester, Lima, Livonia, Mount Morris, Sparta, Springwater, and York. Part of North Dansville was annexed from Steuben County in 1822 and became a separate town when Sparta was divided in 1846. At the same time, the town of West Sparta was also formed from Sparta. The towns of Nunde and Portage were annexed from Allegheny County in 1846, as well as Ashen in 1857, for a total of 17 towns. Avon, Williamsburg, and the hamlet of Lakeville competed for the honor of becoming the county seat, but the distinction was bestowed upon Geneseo, the principal village and center of commerce. The Wadsworths donated a suitable lot, beautifully situated at the north end of the village. The brick courthouse faced Main Street, the jail of wood construction was built directly west, and a one-story cobblestone building for the county clerk's office was built east of the courthouse.
Realm of the Seneca no more, in shadow lies the pleasant vale, gone are the chiefs who ruled of yore like chaff before the rushing gale. Their rivers run with narrowed bounds, cleared are their broad old hunting grounds, and on the ancient battlefield the greensward to the plowman yields. Like mocking echoes of the hill, their fame resounded and grew still, and on green ridge and level plain their hearths will never smoke again. Then fade away the summer flowers, and come the bright autumnal hours. The ripened grain above their graves nods to the wind in golden waves. Fled are their pomp and power like dreams, by scribe unmarked and bard unsung. But mountains, lakes, and rolling streams recall their wild rich forest tongue, and names of melody they bear, sweeter than flute notes on the air.